Hi, it's Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It's Friday, July the 21st, 2023, the end of a week. A week, at least on Keen On, very much dominated by Oppenheimer, the movie, and the man. We did a show earlier this week with the very distinguished contemporary American historian, Evan Thomas. He has a new book out, Road to Surrender, about the American decision in many ways to drop nuclear weapons on Japan. Evan Thomas believes, I think, that it was the right thing to do, both from the point of view of saving the lives of American troops and of Japanese civilians. The moral ambiguity that he talks about in his mind, I think, is fairly self-evident and perhaps not even justified. Meanwhile, we did a show also, which we called Our Oppenheimer Moment, with Greg Mitchell. He's a film critic and an anti-nuclear activist. He had a popular book out a couple of years ago, The Beginning or the End, How Hollywood and America Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. It's a book in part as a critique of a 1947 movie, The Beginning or the End, a Hollywood documentary about the war that glossed over all the moral implications of dropping a nuclear weapon, 2 nuclear weapons on Japan. And of course, this week, yesterday, Oppenheimer came out. I saw it, like many of you. The cinema, my local cinema, the Alamo in the Mission District of San Francisco, was packed at 5 p.m. It's selling out everywhere. And I thought we would have a show specifically on the movie with one of my favorite movie critics, movie writers, Olivia Rutigliano. She is the senior film writer. I'm not sure if there's a junior film writer, but she's the senior film writer at LitHub, where this show is broadcast, distributed. Olivia, you saw the movie yesterday?
Yes, I did.
So let's get into it. First thoughts?
I thought it was fascinating. I thought it was a propulsive, engaging film that managed to combine the conventions of the biopic with a more Nolan-esque, simmering psychological thriller. Even though we know the ending, we know what happens, or we can Wikipedia the life of J. Robert Oppenheimer and find out if we don't know. It still took us through moment by moment through this fascinating period in history in such a way that was riveting and electric and a little bit terrifying, existentially and literally.
Was it a movie, do you think, Olivia, about Oppenheimer or the decision to drop nuclear weapons on Japan, or both? Or, and sorry to add,
Sure.
or a film about McCarthyism or suspicion and paranoia in America against communists?
I think it is about a very specific moment in history, a time in the 20th century where the fate of the world could be determined by a single so-called exemplary man or several exemplary men, sort of all white men, all well-educated, all in prestigious positions at universities and in government. I think it's a film about how in this moment in the 20th century, when the current of McCarthyism is beginning to swell and of course continues to grow, and Hitler is in Germany just absolutely destroying Europe, just taking what he wants. I think it's an interesting movie that places those two large scale, nearly catastrophic in different ways, phenomena in direct conversation with their creators. And I think it does the same with Oppenheimer. It's about the discovery of the technology, the mathematical formulas that created the atom bomb, but it's also about how one man created this entire mushroom cloud, shall we say, of destruction and disorder. I think McCarthy is a similar figure, and I think Hitler is a similar figure. I think McCarthy gets more attention as a figure, although he's not present in the movie. Neither is Hitler. I think both of those men are sort of ghosts with respect to their, shall we say, ideas. But Oppenheimer is equally given as much weight in the film as his idea.
So you think there's if you like, a gendered politics to the movie. It's interesting that there are two prominent women in the film too. Perhaps you might say something about them. I didn't know that, actually. I have to admit, I didn't know much about them before the movie, but they're strongly represented and they play important roles in the narrative.
Well, I don't think the film is so much gendered as sort of accurate in its representation of what the 1930s and 40s and 50s were like in American history and academia, specifically. There's a really wonderful moment in the movie where when Oppenheimer has moved all of the scientists he's recruited to the Los Alamos fake town in New Mexico, or it's a real town, but then a fake town, where the bomb building, the Manhattan Project, will take place principally. And all of the wives of the scientists who are there are being recruited as secretaries to keep the base, the town running. And one of them goes up to Oppenheimer and says, "They've asked me if I know how to type." And he's like, "Do you?" And she's like, "Yeah, that must have not been on the curriculum at the graduate chemistry course I took at Harvard." And then Oppenheimer's like, "Let's put this woman on the chemistry team." I think that's a fascinating moment that shows what this moment is like in terms of this moment in history is like in terms of the reality of gender, professional and economic disparity. But there are two really fascinating, prominent women in the film. They are Kitty Oppenheimer, who is played by Emily Blunt, who is Oppenheimer's wife. And then also Florence
We might
Pugh.
call it long-suffering wife. It doesn't seem.
I think that's accurate. Yeah.
She doesn't seem to have had a lot of fun in her life.
No,
On lots of fronts.
No, absolutely not. And then equally long-suffering, in terms of magnitude, sadly not in terms of length, because her life ended very short. Well, she was very young. Florence Pugh plays Oppenheimer's girlfriend and then mistress, Jean Tatlock, who was a Freudian scholar and psychiatrist.
And communist, well, certainly leftist, communist, radical 1930s, independent woman, sexually independent, intellectually independent. It was interesting, actually, Olivia. I saw the movie with my wife, and afterwards she commented that she thought that Oppenheimer was presented as a little bit of a womanizer. He had those two girlfriends. I mean, the wife, the crazy, beautiful, independent girlfriend, and then one or two other female friends, shall we say. Do you think that's true? Was Oppenheimer presented as this rather, if not, certainly not romantic, I guess what one might think of as an unromantic womanizer?
Unromantic womanizer is an interesting description. I think it's interesting how the movie calls him a womanizer. He's literally referred to as a womanizer, but we don't see many scenes of him flirting. We see a brief scene of him flirting with Jean. We see a brief scene of him flirting with Kitty. And we also see aspects of their later relationships, especially intimate ones. But we don't see a sort of prolonged courtship or pursuit. We also hear later on that he's had an affair with another woman, but we only see them sort of speaking together intimately at parties. There's no indication beyond that there's a relationship. So I thought it was interesting that the film did conclusively label him through dialogue a womanizer, when without that, we might not have paid attention to that aspect as much. I think the film is mostly about Oppenheimer's relationship with his ideas and his demons, and the women in the film sort of are ideas and demons to him as well. I think the film is very much from his perspective. And while Kitty has a really amazing moment in a certain inquiry later in the film, she is put through a lot And we don't get to see too many things from her side of the story. We also don't get to see too many things of Jean. And when we're dealing with a real historical figure who is depressed and who is dealing with suicidal ideation and eventually does kill herself, I think reducing that character to those traits can be problematic and harmful. So I think that all of Oppenheimer's relationships with women could have been fleshed out more in ways that were more progressive or even more true to life. But I do think it's interesting how the film doesn't let us forget that he has these long relationships with women, even though the myth that the movie traffics in is his tortured genius and his relationship to the building of the bomb. The film doesn't ignore, ultimately, even though it does treat rather subtly, that he has had a string of relationships with women.
Yeah, and the wife does come through in the end. I mean, she confronts her husband's accusers very aggressively and very much in contrast to him, although I guess as a wife she's doing it, which perhaps reflected the time. The New York Times, which always seems to have its finger on our pulse, for better or worse, suggested that about the movie, a man for our time. And I think that's something you're also suggesting. The one thing that was missing, I thought, was he was a man for our time in the sense that we seem increasingly concerned with people's backgrounds and their privilege. And he was, like you, he grew up in, well, he lived in New York, but he was from an incredibly wealthy, privileged background. I wonder whether, I was curious why Nolan left that out. Do you think he chose to leave it out, or it just ended up on the cutting room floor in the movie?
Well, the film is 3 hours, so, and while I love a long movie, I mean, I'm happy to go, as they say on the George Lucas talk show, I'm happy to go for an Irishman plus. Like, let's go longer than 3. It's 3 hours and 20 minutes.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying it should have been longer. I mean,
No,
that's
no,
not
no.
my point. I thought it was a bit long too, but it didn't. The movie didn't address his privilege. I mean, it sort of implied it, but it didn't touch on it.
I was just kidding in terms of what seemed necessary to Nolan's ultimate vision. If we get a 3-hour movie, what is he prioritizing? But I think you're right that there's very little that's given to us about his background beyond the sort of origins of his career as a university at a university in Europe, several universities in Europe, perhaps. The first real introduction we get to Oppenheimer as a person is as a very troubled student who nearly murders someone. I think Nolan thinks that's more important to us understanding Oppenheimer as a man than the privileged situations that made him. It's that there's this brief moment of psychosis that or not psychosis, but revenge that he then tempers for the rest of the movie. I think his meekness, even at the end, when he sort of submits to an inquiry that's potentially humiliating for him, is indicative of the fact that he is moving away from the mortal implications of his existence, his feelings, his work. And he is concentrating on theory and abstract concepts like memory and legacy, and he is moving further and further and further away from the material world and the material implications of his work. And I think if the movie had started acknowledging his privilege, I think it would not have been irrelevant, considering this is the arc of the movie, that he starts in a place that's very mortal, that's very literal, and he grows increasingly detached from those forces. I do think, though, that Nolan was more interested in the moments that led up to the creation of the bomb, and I think he has discounted perhaps that that Oppenheimer's privilege would have added to that story. I think he thinks more about Oppenheimer's mind than Oppenheimer's money, and perhaps like someone like Nikola Tesla, who was a ditch digger, would have found his way to greatness with or without the money. Perhaps that seems to be what Nolan is suggesting off the top of my head. I only saw it yesterday.
Yeah, it's interesting that you choose to use the word meekness with Oppenheimer. Coming back to this idea of the times that that Oppenheimer himself is a man for our time. We've done many shows on, shall we say, the crisis of masculinity in the 2020s. Do you think that that Nolan sort of has transformed Oppenheimer into a, shall we say, I'm borrowing your word, a rather meek Brooklynite for the 2020s, a man without a great deal of confidence, certainly a great deal of ability, who doesn't really have a lot of faith in himself, and seems to sort of shrink as his historical role grows. He as a man shrinks. He speaks so quietly. Half the time I couldn't even understand what he was saying.
I don't think it's that he's shrinking. I think it's that he's becoming more ghostly. The film starts with him being a very emotional, very arrogant, dark-haired, fiery young man. And the film progresses with him growing increasingly gaunt and thin, and his large, haunting blue eyes almost bulging out of his face. His hair is growing silver. His cheekbones are more pronounced. He grows quieter. I think it's that as his reputation is growing and he is becoming a very powerful cultural force, that he is becoming something of a ghost. He is becoming something rather ethereal, a haunted figure, made up of particles and less of the existential, shall we say, human who is sort of bound to relationships to others, or bound to this mortal coil in a way. I think he's a figure who exists increasingly in the movie as an idea rather than a person.
Yeah, there's we might call him Promethean. He's haunted, he's ghostly, and of course the real action, the whole point of the film, we don't see, which is the destruction of two Japanese cities. We don't see death. No. But I think you're absolutely right to suggest that he's haunted, that he himself is a ghost as a consequence of all the destruction which his work in Los Alamos and the Manhattan Project produced. There's been some debate, Olivia, about whether or not Nolan should have shown at least the dropping of the bomb, and he leaves it to our imagination. What are your thoughts on that? Should he have included some footage from Hiroshima?
This is a very important question. I'm not exactly sure. I think it would have been a different movie regardless. There are movies like the great, Hiroshima Mon Amour from
Renee, yeah, very good film.
Yeah, that are very much about the absolute ravagement, the horrifying, heartbreaking, unfair destruction of cities and lives, livelihoods, and a country. And I don't think Oppenheimer takes up those same questions. I think it's not that the destruction in Hiroshima and Nagasaki are irrelevant to Oppenheimer. Of course, they're literally the end result of his work. And they're also referenced later in the film as Oppenheimer grows more upset and haunted by what he has wrought, when he has, as he has said, become death, destroyer of worlds. I think there's a way in which showing the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki could have been some sort of, not torture porn, but could have been exploitative. This is not a film that concerns itself too much with the destruction wrought onto the lives of ordinary people. It's very much about the man behind the bomb. And I wonder if looking at, even for a moment, at the people whose lives were ended and ruined, and just in ways that we can't even understand. I wonder if that would be some sort of like sick wish, fulfillment of the view, like, oh, let's see what happened. And I think the film is careful not to reward the viewer with images of destruction. At the same time, I think it is extremely important to remember what actually happened. Not only because we're in this Barbenheimer moment where the Barbie Oppenheimer double feature has yielded memes and like the phrase "I am become death, destroyer of worlds" in the Barbie font on t-shirts, but I think it's very easy to forget that hundreds of thousands of people died and got cancer and whose lives were destroyed, not even just in Japan, but also in the United States from nuclear testing. And there were people in New Mexico who are non-white people, Mexican and indigenous people, who got cancer as a result of nuclear testing, especially. So I think the film would have done well to acknowledge that two things. One, that so many people's lives were absolutely ruined, but also that non-white, non-privileged people who may have been deemed less or more expendable culturally, not necessarily by Oppenheimer, but by the sort of white male power structures that were in place, did have their lives ended. I think at the same time, if Oppenheimer had encountered a photograph of horrifically maimed or dead people, I think it would have served his narrative more than theirs. And so I would have cautioned against using the real life tragic stories and the very important historical reality of the bomb in a way to augment the telling of Oppenheimer's story. But I do think that if Nolan were interested in telling a story about the actual reality of the bomb for the Japanese people and also for the people in New Mexico or elsewhere whose lives have been ruined by nuclear experimentation and testing, that would be great. A nice chaser to Oppenheimer would probably be How to Blow Up a Pipeline, the thriller film that came out.
Yeah, that was a good film. Although I think it attracts a very different kind of audience. The New York Times also ran a who's who in Oppenheimer, Guide to the Real People and Events. One of the more memorable aspects of the film was when, in the movie itself, and perhaps in real life, when Oppenheimer met Harry Truman.
Mm-hmm.
What did you think of that moment? And what did you think of the representation of some of the other real life people, from Albert Einstein to General Grove to, of course, Harry Truman?
The Harry Truman representation was particularly salient to me. When I was in high school, we learned about the various white male American presidents who were responsible for unbelievable destruction, not only to American lives, but also to the lives of people abroad, like Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson and Vietnam, and also Harry Truman with respect to the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima.
And of course, JFK, who oddly enough pops up.
Yes. I think, but I think the film is very much about, is so much about Oppenheimer that when all of a sudden we get Truman's very unremorseful, very callous perspective, it's sort of jarring if you've sort of been not indoctrinated, but if you've learned this narrative about the fact that, like, oh, it was really hard for Truman to decide whether or not to drop the bomb. And the film comes down on the conclusion that I think that even if he had been remorseful, it wouldn't have made one iota of difference. And so it allows Truman to become an avatar of sort of everything that's wrong with the Manhattan Project and the dropping of the bomb, sort of distilled into a single person. And it sort of makes Oppenheimer a little less culpable. I mean, literally, Truman is like, no, I dropped the bomb. You didn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's these men competing about who's going to be more guilty about the dropping of Well,
And in a way, I think the film, that's sort of the way the film like transfers the blame away from Oppenheimer, and it concentrates more on Oppenheimer as this like weird, liminal, increasingly ghostly, death-oriented, dying star of a person,
yeah.
without having to worry about the moral complications, which I think is like potentially dangerous and loaded. But I also think it's kind of important to show how in the American the preservation of America and American ideals, uh, an American leader would have been relatively remorseless about destroying hundreds of thousands of lives of people in an Asian country. Notably, you know, the Oppenheimer pushes for the use of the bomb on the Japanese continent, even after it was originally developed with thoughts that it would be.
Yeah, I'm guessing that the Truman fans might suggest that Truman was dealt with unfairly. He had no idea of even the Manhattan Project's existence until he came to power, and he inherited the whole thing. So blood may have been on his hands, but he had no choice on it. Olivia, much has been made of Nolan's remarks that the movie is a warning about our contemporary tech fixation with AI. Lots of pieces from Wired, the FT, the Guardian about whether or not he's using it as a warning. He talks about strong parallels. It's odd, as you say, as he becomes paler and paler, more and more haunted and ghostly in the film, it's the technology that quite literally catches fire. It dominates the screen and it dominates the world. So Oppenheimer becomes, I guess, a symbol of the increasingly footnoted nature of human beings and humanity. The same seems to be quite literally true today with AI and artificial intelligence and our transformation into a footnote in history. Do you think the movie did a good job there? I mean, it's hard to know whether or not Nolan really wanted to bring up the AI issue, but is technology the real star or the anti-hero in this movie?
It's an interesting question. I don't think the movie has much to say about AI specifically because the um, the politics about AI, or not even the politics, the dynamics of AI are very different than the analog technology of bomb dropping in 1945. The AI question involves the way corporations are using this anti-human technology to replace humans in a way that disenfranchises workers and steals writers' ideas and artists' styles and undermines the human element of art and production. I think Oppenheimer isn't about the human element of art and production in the same way. I think it's about um, a man who did a bunch of mathematical calculations that led to the recruitment of other men who did mathematical calculations, and a few women who did mathematical calculations that caused the US military to drop a bomb a on a whole civilization. I think those are very different. I think the best movie made recently about AI that is allegorical is Top Gun: Maverick. I mean,
I haven't seen that
no
one.
sir, not today. Like, we're not gonna let drones, you know, pilot planes. We're not gonna let CGI dominate practical effects in movies. I think is a more interesting parallel. Not that I'm advocating for one movie that promotes the military industrial complex over another.
Right.
But
It's one of the striking things is that the figure in the movie who doesn't have broad shoulders, very sloping shoulders, in fact, but who carries the weight of humanity, the one truly human figure in the film is Albert Einstein. We did a movie, we did a show about him. Someone wrote a book called The Einstein Effect. Do you think Einstein is represented in almost like a absurdly metaphorical way? I mean, it doesn't really seem human. It just seems to be every man represented. I mean, it's beautifully acted, but I thought there was something odd about his appearance in the film.
I think the inclusion of Einstein in the film is interesting Because of course Einstein is the most famous scientist probably of all time. If I assume that if we asked people on the street who is the most famous scientist, they would say Einstein and not J. Robert Oppenheimer. So Einstein is a sort of way in, I think, for a lot of audiences who might not be as familiar with the politics or the political and scientific players of the Manhattan Project or the like 1945 scientific community. I mean, like, it was great to see like Niels Bohr, but there are a lot of names that and certainly I'm sure a lot of moviegoers wouldn't have on the tip of their tongues. So I think Einstein, because we associate Einstein so closely with the Manhattan Project, and yet he had far less to do with it than virtually any of the scientists represented in the film, provides a way in to understand the dynamics of this community and also the implications of science in the larger world. I don't know much about Einstein as a person, but I thought Tom Conti's portrayal of him was excellent. But as you say, yes, he is a metaphorical figure. He is a figure who ultimately says the film's thesis, which is, of course, about the dangers of playing with nuclear materials or putting nuclear materials in the hands of the U.S. military.
And it was his great breakthrough, of course, and he had no idea, I guess, when he
Right.
made it. He's presented, on the one hand, of course, as the world's most famous scientist, but as a post-scientist.
Right. Yes, he's an esteemed elder. I mean, he's the closest thing we have to a god in this movie.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say the same thing.
Right? I mean, if Oppenheimer is Prometheus or Hades or, the devil, I don't know. The film doesn't have much to say about Catholicism. But if he's some sort of negative figure in the universal ideological construction in this movie, then he is Einstein's opposite. He is death and Einstein is not. Einstein is some sort of respected scientific elder who might as well be a god in this community. I think that he gets the sort of mysterious thread that propels a big question in the film is especially satisfying because when a character we don't know about or don't care about, like if Alden Ehrenreich, who plays like an unnamed governmental official, like cabinet associate, gets the last word of the movie, I think it's less not last word of the movie, but the last big scene in the movie. I think that's a lot less effective than if someone we've seen photos of sticking his tongue out, on the sidewalk at university poster sales. I think it's a lot less important than if a figure like that delivers the big message. So I think that's why Einstein is so abstractly godlike. I think he is supposed this characterization of him, the trafficking that Nolan does in Einstein's fame and like eternal fame and reputation is intended to impart the big message of the film, which is that it's very, very, very bad now that we have the ability to destroy the world.
So coming back to the Mitchell book, The Beginning or the End, the book about the 1947 film, How Hollywood and America Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, might the subtitle to the Oppenheimer movie be How Hollywood and America Learned to Start Worrying and Hate the Bomb?
It's an interesting question. I don't know if Hollywood hates the bomb. Hollywood has
This is a Hollywood film, isn't it? I mean, it's a big budget,
yes,
big star film shown all over the world, made by Hollywood's most sort of illustrious, marketable director, Christopher Nolan, who's done all these other mainstream films, Dunkirk, and all these superhero films.
But the title of the Stanley Kubrick film, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, that second subtitle is really important because in that movie, men actually sort of have like orgasmic sex with bombs. Like Slim Pickens rides the bomb to its eventual explosion. There's some sort of like weird masculine euphoria coded in the bombings in that movie. And I think Oppenheimer is very interesting because although the movie is anti-nuclear, Christopher Nolan also set off a giant bomb. It is not a CGI bomb, I believe. I was reading that he received permission to set up some sort of practical effect that could simulate explosion.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Hollywood, I mean, okay, I should verify this, but I was reading this a while ago, that the CGI in the movie is not does not complete the representation of the bomb, that there is some sort of real fiery explosion. And movies are full of explosions. I mean, from Michael Bay to now this film. I mean, I don't think Hollywood hates bombs. I think Hollywood is fascinated with bombs. And I think most people in the 20th century accessed the concept of bombs through the footage of those mushroom clouds. So I think Hollywood has an eerie fascination. I think the messaging of Oppenheimer is ultimately about how nuclear weapons are bad. But I do think the scene where all of the scientists see the bomb go off in the desert at a distance through their special protective glasses and lenses, and Benny Safdie has sunscreen on so that the blast won't, destroy his skin. And I think there's a scene of theatricality and reverence and excitement and the culmination of very abstract scientific and mathematical theories. And when you watch that manifest as an explosion, I think that is very exciting for the scientists in this scene. I think it's very exciting for the movie, and I think it's very exciting for the filmmakers, especially because the camera moves around the orange, blossoming mushroom cloud slowly, and there are lots of golden embers like in the sky.
Well, in other words, what you're saying is that's the sex in the film, and in contrast with the actual sex in the film, which was sort of miserable in a Freudian way, I think you'd be right. Maybe people shouldn't take their kids too much pornography when it comes to violence. Finally, Olivia, what does this film tell us about the current state of Hollywood? You mentioned we're living in this weird summer where the two dominant films are Barbie and Oppenheimer. Politico ran a piece saying which they are senators, which movie they're seeing first. It seems in an odd way, even if this film's trying to be very 2020s, there's a return to very traditional Hollywood values, big budget movies, big stars. As I said, Nolan's done Dunkirk, and before our film, there was an ad for Napoleon, a film by Ridley Scott, another old timer, even much older than Nolan, but another classic Hollywood director. So we're back to big biopics. Is that really what Hollywood's all about these days?
I don't know if biopics ever really went away, but I do think there's a certain kind of like studio system era, giant splashy war movie, epic movie that's coming out. We have like a new Cleopatra movie with Gal Gadot that like incorrectly uses the Greek alphabet on the poster to spell Cleopatra. I think that Oppenheimer is absolutely an encapsulation of a certain kind of like late nouveau golden age Hollywood filmmaking that like we don't really see to an extent anymore. I mean, we're not getting like Ben-Hur. I think he makes Ben-Hur kind of movies in every sense. I do think that Oppenheimer is a very excellent movie. It's extremely well done and
very excellent. Wow.
Very excellent. Very, very excellent. I will throw as many modifiers in front of excellent as need. I mean, it's a fascinating and very well done film. It comes with implications, and those implications need to be teased out and analyzed. And it's not a movie that you should see and never think about again. It's very important to keep thinking about what was included and not included and how things were represented and not. But as a film, as an engine of narrative and tone and theme, it is seamless and fascinating. But I also think we are in an era of lots of interesting, weird, experimental types of storytelling, like Barbie, which is not some sort of like weird mass market Airhead movie. It's one of the weirdest, most fascinating thought experiments I've ever seen on screen. And if Hollywood is giving us the return of the studio system and large, splashy epics, even if they are about white men and should definitely be more about or proportionately, Hollywood should be making big splashy epics about non-white men too. But if we're getting like a certain level of committed practical filmmaking that produces excellent movies, and we're also getting weird, interesting indie movies that allow women and historically marginalized filmmakers to have bigger budgets and bigger attention, and to make films about their experiences or their thoughts, or films that interrogate the status quo, I think that's great, and I think both should exist at the same time. I'm not knocking Marvel movies, but I would really love to see more movies like both Barbie and Oppenheimer in the box office.
I have to admit, I don't agree with you. I don't think it was a very, very excellent film. I would give it, I thought it was way too long. It was patchy. There were some good moments. The second half was much better than the first, but I found it, I have to admit, rather annoying.
Oh, I thought the first act was better.
So I would give it, I'd give the first half probably 1 or 2 stars. The second half, maybe 4 stars. What would you give it overall?
I don't know. How many stars are we talking here?
Well, you always get 5 stars, Olivia.
5? Maybe 4. 4 out of 5.